Welcome back to Swift Fundamentals. Today, we will look at arrays and how they help us create collections beyond just one variable. So let's imagine that we wanted to create a collection of movies, for example. Well, I would write my first movie, like movie 1, and then set that to some kind of string. Let's say Jurassic Park. And then if I wanted to create another movie, I would have to write var once again and create movie 2 and then set that to some other string. Let's say The Matrix. And so on and so forth. But this is getting really messy. As we see, we're creating multiple variables and we have to keep renaming them something different since we can't keep reinitializing the same variable. And then it just kind of gets redundant, right? So movie 1, movie 2, movie 3, the variables are starting to lose meaning in their name. So we need something that works a little better than this. And that's where arrays come in. So how do we make our first array? Well, let's start with a name. In this case, let's use something plural since it's going to hold several movies. We'll call it movies. And then we will say, okay, this is going to be an array, which is noted by the square brackets. We need to tell it what type it's going to hold inside. So let's say this is going to hold strings. This colon should remind you of type annotation. We're essentially letting it know, okay, it's going to be an array of strings. And then we need to set it to an actual array. So let's start with an empty one. We could also start by putting the things already inside, such as the two movies that we have up here. So let's go ahead and write that out. And each string is going to be separated by a comma, as so. Do note that you could have also easily just written the variable itself, such as movie 1, and that would also be acceptable, since it is a string. But do note, as I mentioned before, if you try to put a different type, such as an integer or a double or a boolean, it'll tell you that this is an error because it's expecting strings inside of this array. So do keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and delete this. Perfect. Now, this isn't the only way we can initialize arrays. We can also go ahead and just use inference. For example, we can say grades, set that equal to our notation for arrays, and start writing things inside. Let's say we got 100, 32, that was awful, and then, I don't know, an 87. And it automatically tells that, it automatically can figure out that, okay, this is going to be an array of integers. So because of type inference, it could also figure this out. It cannot figure it out if it's empty, and that's why we started off with this type annotation before. But if you go ahead and use literals, meaning you put a literal type such as a string or an integer inside, it can go ahead and figure out, okay, I know that this array contains integers or arrays or booleans or doubles, for example. Yet another way we can do a empty array to start off with, we can also say var. Now let's imagine we are going to say types of fruits. So we want strings. We can go ahead and write the notation like this, and then put the initializer, these parentheses at the end. So this right here is similar to, let's say, var veg for vegetables, and then type annotate it with the string like this, and then setting that equal to empty brackets. This right here and this right here are similar in that it's just an empty array that expects strings. So there are many different ways that you can initialize an array, starting off with things inside and type annotation, using type inference to figure it out off the start by what's inside, and then creating empty arrays that you can later add things as you go along, as we will see in the next example. Now, before we move on to the next examples, I want to show two more ways that we can create an array. The first is using the initializer that takes in a repeating value. So let's say that we have var 3 zeros, and what we want is an array with 3 zeros. Well, we can go ahead and do it like we did before, right? Just writing them out. But another way is writing the word array opening the initializer or a parentheses. And there's this one that takes in a repeating and count. Let's go ahead and use that. And here we write the thing that we want to repeat. So in this case, 0. And count refers to how many times you want that to repeat inside the array. So let's say 3. And then let's go ahead and print 3 zeros to see what we have inside. And as you see, we get 3 zeros. Another cool thing that we can do is say we want var letters, and we want the letters individually inside of an array of the word apple. So we can go ahead and write array, open your parentheses, and write the string apple. And then let's go ahead and print out what we have in letters. And we see that we get each individual letter of the word apple. Just good things to know moving forward. The next thing we need to consider is how can we access something inside of our array? So let's say that we wanted to take the matrix inside our movies array. Well, first we start off with the array that we're trying to access. Let's say movies, we can call that. And then we subscript it, or we add the square brackets inside. And then we put in the number that corresponds to the index of the element. And if you've seen any code memes, you know that the first one starts with 0 and not 1. So it goes 0, 1, and 2. Therefore, the matrix would be in index 1. And let's go ahead and run this, and we see that what we get on our sidebar here is the matrix. So if we were to like print it out to the console, down here we would get the matrix. You see? And then we could capture that in a variable. Let's say the middle, var the middle element, and set that to movies, subscripted with 1. And we see that the middle element now holds the matrix. Great, so now we know how to access something in our array. Now, let's say we wanted to get the first thing, right? The first element. Well, we know that in every array, we start off with 0, so we would get the first element by simply putting 0, and we get Jurassic Park. But be forewarned, if we go ahead and let's say we want to say the last element, and we set that to movies, and here we can see what the array is, but let's say we didn't know how many things are, so we just take a shot in the dark, and we say, okay, let's say that it's 5. And we run that, we see that we get an error because we went further than the array is actually capable of. So whenever you try to access something that doesn't exist, you will crash your program, and that's something that you do have to keep in mind. So you can't just guess what the array has. You have to be pretty sure, otherwise you will crash. But luckily, there is some ways and some tricks that we have to access, like let's say the last array, without having to worry. The first thing that will help us figure that out is this property called count. And what the property count does is it lets us know how many things are inside that element in that array. Sorry, how many elements are inside that array. So let's call movies dot, and we can write count, and we run this. We see that we get, oh wait, we're still getting the error because of this 5. So let's just comment this out for now. And let's run this again. And we get 3, right? Because we have 1, 2, 3. Now, something that we also know is that the index starts out at 0. So the index up here, right, is, let's make a comment, is 0, then it's 1, then it's 2. Well, let's imagine that for grades, we had a few more grades, right? If we look at grades, the index is 0, then it's 1, then 2, then 3, and then 4. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. As it turns out, the last element will always be whatever the count is -1, right? Because you're offset by 1 since you're starting off the count of your index by 0. Meaning that if we always want to get the last thing in an array, well, we can simply just say var movies, or rather var the last element. Actually, let's bring that back. And here inside, we can write movies.count, because this evaluates to just a simple number, right? Now, if we run this, we can see that we're still going to crash because we're 1 more than there actually exists, right? We're getting 3 here and there's no index 3. But if we then do -1, this thing gets evaluated first. It realizes, okay, 3 minus 1 is 2. And then it goes into movies and checks, okay, what index is 2? What do we have in there? And if we run this, we see that now we get Jurassic Park, which we're repeating here, and it's the last element inside of this array. This is a very powerful property that we need to keep in mind because it allows us to do all sorts of fun things like get the last element. Imagine if you wanted to get the middle element. Well, let's say var middle equal movies, and then we subscript it again. We write movies.count, and then we can simply divide that by 2 and see that we get the matrix, right? The middle element, because it's going to take 3 divided by 2. And since it's integer division, as we saw in our integer lesson, it's just simply going to go to 1 and then drop all of the decimal numbers because it does not concern itself with decimal numbers when it's integers. So, as I mentioned before, integer division is something that we can keep in mind, and it's helpful for these types of situations. Just to show that this also works in a longer array, let's say var middle grade, and set that to grades, subscript that with grades.count divided by 2. And because it knows that this whole thing gets evaluated into an integer, what it expects for a subscript, it'll take it in and then gives us 87, which is the middle digit inside of this array. Okay, so very useful property to keep in mind. Another property that is pretty useful is the IsEmpty property. So we can check something like var result and set that equal to fruits, and then access IsEmpty inside of the fruits. And we see that we get true because it is empty. And if we go ahead and say second result, and then set that equal to something that's not empty, let's say like grades, and then put IsEmpty, it gives us that it indeed is not empty. It gives us a false. So this property is just a Boolean that lets you know if the array is empty or not. A good, helpful property so you don't access something inside something that's empty and then crash, right? So let's say back to what I was saying before about crashing when you use an index that doesn't exist. If I go to fruits and then set 0 in our subscript and then run this, we expect to crash because there's nothing inside, and therefore when it tries going inside there, it crashes altogether. So combining these ideas, you can simply say something like if if grades, rather, let's say fruit, right? Because that one's actually empty. So if it's empty, then print is empty, else print, let's say the first thing inside of fruits, let's say 0, right? And so this is going to check if it's empty, which will result in a bool of true or false. If it is empty, then it just prints out it's empty. Else, if there is something inside, because this yielded a false, then it'll go ahead and print out whatever the first item is in fruit. So if we run this, we should expect it's empty. And this is a way of protecting against accessing something that doesn't exist. We're putting all our lessons together now using control flow, using the property of IsEmpty of an array, and accessing something if we can. The next thing that we can also think about is, all right, let's say we already have an established list, such as, or established array, such as movies, and we want to add something later on. Or fruits, for example, since right now it's empty, and we want to actually print out something. Well, there is a method that we can use to add things inside. A method is just some sort of functionality, sort of like a property, but this is more, it does something to mutate the array. It changes the array somehow or does something with the array. So let's call fruits. And we have a dot append, which simply adds something inside that array. So let's go ahead and add an apple. Obviously, whatever the type of the array that it starts out with, such as like string over here, is what it expects. So you can't go ahead and append something like 3 because it will immediately know, okay, you can't do that since it's expecting a string. Perfect. Okay, so now let's run this. And you see that our if-else statement still is printing it's empty because the append happens afterwards. So yet another instance where you need to consider how code goes from the beginning, from the top line, from line 1, all the way to the bottom, and it goes in order. So if we wanted to make this work with our control flow statements, let's put this over here. And let's get rid of it here, and let's run this now. And now we see that when it hits the control flow, it skips over IsEmpty. Rather, it checks it, realizes that it's false, so it doesn't execute this, and then just executes the else statement into our fruit, and we can write out, and it prints out apple since there's something inside. And there's no reason to worry about crashing. So very helpful property and very helpful method to add things as we need. This isn't the only way that we can add something to our array. We can also simply write fruits plus equals let's say pear. And then let's go ahead and print out what fruit looks like at this point. Now, because it's an array, when we do the plus equals, we can't just leave it as a string because the way that it's being interpreted is that you're saying a string is being added to the array, not into the array, but rather like together, and it can't mix types. So what it's expecting is this right here to add onto the array. And now we see that we actually get the addition inside like we would with an append. And you can add arrays together to create other arrays in a separate variable. So let's say var advanced fruit, and then set that to whatever fruits is plus, let's say kiwi. And now you get a full array that has all of those things. Whoops, sorry. All together. Yet another way that we can add together arrays. But sometimes you want to add to a pre-existing array, so we do the plus equals or append. Sometimes you want to create a new array altogether using different arrays, and that's something else that we can do here. Okay, so now we know how to add something. Now let's say we wanted to remove something from an array. We can call advanced fruit dot remove at, and we need to put a number that we can remove at an index. So let's say 0, and then let's print out what advanced fruit looks like at this point after the removal. And we see that pear and kiwi now exist with no apple because we moved at 0. Again, do note that if we put in a number that doesn't exist in terms of an index, we can very well crash, just like when we access a number that doesn't exist. So if we wanted to remove, let's say, the last number, we can also use our trick from before of writing advanced fruit dot count -1, and this secures us that we're going to remove the last one. Though If we remove something from an empty array, we will crash, and then we will need to use something like control flow to be careful and mindful about that. The last thing I want to show, though by no means the last thing you can do with arrays, is called an array slice. And basically that just means that we want to slice a piece of the array and get that back. So let's say we start off with var slice equals. Now let's call our grades. So I want the last 3 grades. So we call grades. And then we set that to a closed range. Whoops, sorry, no space. We set our subscript to a closed range. So here we're going to say 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 2 to 4. And then let's print out our slice. Now, because it's a slice, we get the array, but there is a tricky thing about it. Let's say then we want to access the number 87. Well, convention and what I've taught you so far would tell you, okay, so then you simply call slice. Whoops, wrong slice, a lowercase one. And then you access the subscript at 0, right? Well, you crash and you get the out of bounds error. Now, why is that? Well, when you slice something, as it turns out, it keeps the index from before. So 0 is really 2 in this case because you slice from 2 to 4. And therefore, you would have to write 2 if you wanted to access the very first thing. Now, this is super confusing and can be a bit of an inconvenience. So a way that we can mitigate that is that we can write array and turn the whole thing into a regular array instead of an array slice. And now when you do 0, we can see that we get the first number. So this here is just a slice, and it takes the old index or indices. And then you can use the array property, the array initializer here to create an array out of this array slice. And that sets everything back to the way you expected. And we get the 0 index for the first object, for the first element. Just something to keep in mind when we use array slices. Sometimes you'll need to do this to let it behave more like what you expect. Other times you can simply work with the slice as it is. And slices also make sure that the index exists, because if it doesn't, var, let's say error equals grades at 9 to, 80, you can expect this to also crash because it doesn't exist. So indices are something you really want to keep in mind that they exist. We can also do our trick for the last digit here using grades.count -1, because this whole thing evaluates to an integer, then an integer to an integer works, and then it gets subscript into the actual array, and then the whole thing gets turned into an array. So this also works over here. Again, this grade.count, or rather an array.count, is super useful for this reason. You're going to see this pattern of grades.count, or rather array.count -1, to get to talk about the last thing over and over. So it's something to become familiar with. But if you can use a literal, you can also do that as well. This, but like I said, is by no means the only things you can do with arrays. We will find out in our next video how we can go through, let's say, the entire array one by one in something called a loop. And we will also later on how to use a few other methods that we have beyond just append and remove that relies us to know something called optionals. But when we get to that lesson, I will show you how to use those. Until then, just keep on practicing.